So during gastrulation, right, we have the formation of those three embryonic germ tissue layers that are going to start the early development of some of the organs. And this process is completed with what we call organogenesis, right? So the formation of the organs and the tissues from the three germ tissue layers. All right, so once again, the genesis refers to the creation. So we're creating organs. In gastrulation, we were creating tissue layers, basically. And we've already talked about the organ systems that are derived from each of those different tissue layers. So what I want to mention on this slide is really kind of the very first organ system to develop is that of the nervous system. So this happens in early organogenesis, and it occurs, we said the nervous system develops from the ectoderm. So in this image, in this kind of blue and purpley area, is really kind of the ectoderm. And it's showing what's called the neural plate, which is going to fold inward. So it's part of the ectoderm that was on the outside of that gastrula and now folds inward. And the two ends of the ectoderm are going to then fuse together. So that way that tissue is now forming a tube to the inside of the gastrula. And then you got your ectoderm on the outside, and we now have this kind of purpley tube that we recognize as the neural tube. So this neural tube is going to become the spinal cord and the brain in some organisms. So it's kind of the precursor to the main components of the nervous system. And when we get into animals, we'll be talking about whether they possess a nerve cord and a notochord. So the nerve cord refers to this kind of neural tube development. In other words, kind of having something similar or akin to a spinal cord. And the notochord is kind of a support system. So just like our spinal column, where we have vertebrae that surround our spinal cord and protect it and help give support and anchorage for muscles. So the notochord, though, is derived from the mesoderm, whereas the neural tube, or our spinal cord, is derived from the ectoderm. So our vertebra comes from different germ tissue layer than our neural tubes. Okay. So this comes from, once again, kind of cells migrating to various areas, and that can only happen after we get a sense of what is the dorsal surface, what is the back side of the animal, what is the belly side of the animal, the ventral side, so that it knows where to produce that neural tube, right? So whether it's, do you want it to develop on the belly side or do we want it to develop on the back side of the body? That directionality has to be established first through that gastrulation process. All right, so we've talked about fertilization. Well, we started actually with the production of the gametes through the process of meiosis, and then we talked about fertilization, where the egg and sperm combine to form the zygote, and then that zygote goes through continued mitotic divisions in the process of cleavage, and that forms the blastula, which then goes through gastrulation to produce the three different germ tissue layers. And then from those germ tissue layers, we can start to develop our different organ systems. Okay. And now we're going to fast forward. And here we've got a developing child. So we're going to mention kind of the trimesters of human pregnancy. So we've been kind of following this timeline in a sense of how embryonic development occurs. You know, what needs to happen first, and we're looking at the different processes that give rise to an embryo. In humans, when we start talking about trimesters, we're breaking up the pregnancy into 3-month increments. And this is done mainly for kind of the parents to help them understand what to expect at each stage. It helps the doctors to kind of monitor the development of the fetus and to help schedule prenatal care and tests that should be done during certain times. So it's kind of a designation that we've introduced to kind of make it easier for us. Okay. And you're going to find that there's a lot of that the timelines are kind of fluid as far as certain things, when certain things happen or occur. So if you read other sources, you might find some things that might sound a little conflicting. And it's, you know, so it could be slightly different than what I might be saying here, in other words. So the first trimester is usually from week 1 through week 12. And this is obviously when we have the zygote, the fertilized egg. We said it's going to then travel down into the uterus, implant into the uterine wall, and start to go through mitotic divisions, and then develop those germ tissue layers, and then go through organogenesis to start getting those organ systems in place. Okay, so that's kind of that first trimester. And this is when the embryo is most susceptible to environmental toxins at this point in time. So it's very, you know, whatever the mother has been introduced, because if you think about it, it's forming the organs of the body. So just about every organ in the body can be affected by being introduced to some type of toxin. All right, so whether it's cigarette smoke, or whether it's alcohol, or other types of toxins that the mother might be exposed to, that can also be passed on to the child at this point in time. So it can be very damaging to the embryo. All right. After that is the second trimester, so from weeks 13 to 26. So at this point, all the organ systems should be present. The fetus is going to begin to increase in size. So we call it a fetus at this point, kind of after 8 weeks of development, it's considered to be a fetus. And this is when the mother might feel fetal movements. So this is when she might feel the baby kicking at this point. That's not to say that she may not feel movements during the first trimester. Sometimes people say they feel this kind of fluttering, but this is the more physical, you know, of the baby kicking that people can feel. And then the third trimester is from weeks 27 to 40, and this is where there's a lot of rapid growth of the fetus, and the brain is developing. The fetus is developing fat, layers of fat in their body, so there's a lot of weight gain during this time, and the body is then preparing for the birth of the child. All right, and so that completes the development, and that is all that you really need to cover for this chapter 22.